tons of new cards to review, folks, like the new Mage Prime.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right. Kicking things off here with Astromancer Solarian, a new 2-mana 3/2. It's the Prime for Mage. Spell damage +1 at a base level, and then, of course, shuffle Solarian Prime into your deck when he dies. So first things first, a nice little minion that could offer some utility via that spell damage. Just throw that into a turn, get a nice little boost to Frostbolt, Fireball, Flame Strike, whatever it is. Solarian himself has a little bit of value, plus he's pretty easy to trade in, kill off, move Solarian Prime into your deck, which is very cool. The big boy here is a 7-mana 7/7, also with spell damage +1, and Battlecry cast 5 random mage spells with targeting that's going to hit enemies if possible. So in the past, you might have risked something like a Polymorph or Fireball hitting something you care about, one of your own minions or perhaps your own face with Fireball. Now it's always going to target enemies. So Pyroblast, guess what? No longer a risk for you, but certainly a risk for your opponent. If they don't have any minions in particular, a lot of the burst damage spells for Mage are going to go to the face, which is really cool. All those polymorphs are going to hit your opponent's minions instead of yours. Now, Mage still does have some spells that may not be particularly beneficial, like Arcane Missiles is like, well, okay, it worked out, it hit their stuff, but it wasn't exactly a high-powered spell. But the fact that you're limiting this to Mage spells and you're narrowing it into your opponents only means Solarian Prime's usually going to end up with some really good results, not to mention he's just a 7-mana 7/7 as well. So I think this card's absolutely amazing. You're often going to clear part of your opponent's board, get a couple secrets, do some face damage, generate a lot of value potentially by adding things to your hand. All in all, when you play this, you're going to expect a really big swing turn and big things to happen. Even if 1 or 2 spells fizzle, it's still a 7-mana 7/7 and you're getting something beneficial out of it 99.9% of the time. I mean, maybe if you cast like 5 Arcane Intellects, you might be sad because you burn your deck or something, but most of the time this will be a very big play. I think it works really well for Mage because of the utility of Solarian itself, which means this feels like a super strong card. So up next here we have a new rogue legendary, Shadowjeweler Hanar, clearly collecting some secret infinity stones here. It's a 2-mana 1/5. After you play a secret, discover a secret from another class. So essentially this can be a like secret generating and playing engine where if you're on, say, 10 mana, you kick this off with one of your rogue secrets. Presumably we're getting 3 of those. And that's 2 mana for this guy, 2 mana for the rogue secret. You get to choose a secret, which means I don't know if we'll be offered one from each distinct class, because there is Paladin, Hunter, and Mage normally with secrets. Maybe it's just any random secrets, but regardless, you can pick one of any of those 3 costs, whatever you think is going to fit in better. So maybe you try to get a bunch of cheap Paladin secrets, maybe a mix and match, probably just take the best thing you can get, and, you know, maybe another 2-mana Hunter secret, and then you play 4 secrets on top of your Shadowjeweler Hanar while still also generating an extra secret in hand with 10 mana for a pretty crazy, like, Christmas tree, super turn sort of thing, and it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to anticipate exactly what your logic was. Now, even if you play this guy earlier in the game, just like on turn 2 with 5 health, I think he's very likely to survive into something like a turn 3 secret play, or maybe you could find a 1-mana Paladin secret to stay on curve and just get another secret in hand. So a lot of value generation and some pretty disruptive tempo possibilities as well, because we know some secrets are very, very good and cause a lot of friction and problems for your opponents. And anywhere in the mid game, of course, I think this guy just makes sense too. Even with 6-7 mana, you can play just this guy in a secret and have a pretty good turn assembled. And on top of the crazy high-powered secret synergy cards we've seen already, I'm starting to have a little bit more faith that this package could work. Now, one downside is if the rogue secrets are bad, I wasn't super excited about the ambush secret, then this could feel like just an overcommitment to running this entire package just to get like 1 or 2 good cards out of it. Maybe you got to run 5 bad cards. That's not generally a recipe for success in Hearthstone, but because I think this is a pretty powerful effect, the Super Sap is insane. I can't remember that card's name, so I'm just going to call it the Super Sapper. I'll be frank. Between all that, I think Shadowjeweler Hanar makes sense. Plus, just cheap, sticky minions like this have been successful in Rogue in the past that generate stuff. Think like Evil Miscreant, for instance, and all the secrets don't have the reactivity in many cases of lackeys. There's still a similar kind of package coming together. So sure enough, Shadowjeweler Hanar looks like a really solid card to me. So next up here we have Alar, famed phoenix in World of Warcraft, hangs out with our buddy Kael'thas. It's a 5-mana, 7/3 neutral elemental with Death Rattle. Summon a 0/3 Ashes of Alar that resurrects this minion on your next turn. As you can see, Ashes of Alar there reads at the start of your turn, transform this into Alar. So in a way, this actually feels a bit like Nithog, the Shaman legendary dragon from last set, Descent of Dragons, in that it summons you this little 0/3 minion. If that 0/3 lives, you get something cool out of it. And in this case, you could start chaining all of these Alars together. Now, the big problem for a card like this is 3 health. Everything has 3 health, which is a really, really easy amount of health to deal with for so many decks. Particularly in a rush-driven game of Hearthstone that we have these days, everything has rush. Killing Alar is going to be very easy for people to do at 3 health, and then following up with the Ashes of Alar is probably not going to be hard either. Now, it does kind of take like a 2-in-1 effort on any given turn, which might be hard to piece together on turn 5 exactly for Alar. So there might be that occasional like moment where this lines up and the stars align and Alar works out and you get 2 Alars. But the notion of getting like more than 2 Alars is really, really tough. So yeah, like this forces a removal. Like your opponent has to deal with it, but the Ashes they deal with for free. Alar they can probably deal with very, very efficiently. Tons of removal spells, cheap rush minions, whatever it is. So all in all, I'm having trouble figuring out what deck's going to run this and what meta this is ever going to work in when there's so much instant clear potential across a wide variety of decks, right? Even just Stormhammers and all that stuff too, just weapons and cheap spells, rush, all of it deals with Alar so effectively. Now, of course, cards like this always have that caveat like, well, there's some kind of crazy Death Rattle synergy card that comes along. We do have already Terran Gorefiend, like we saw. So Terran Gorefiend could like kill your Alar, summon the Ashes, kind of bake in the egg style of the Alar. But the problem here is the egg is sort of inverse, right? You've got the minion you care about on the front half, and the egg itself on the second half, which often makes it just so much easier to deal with. So your Terran's going to unleash the Ashes of Alar, which is like, oh, okay, well, now that's easy to kill. And then even the buffed Alar that comes out of your Terran Gorefiend, it's still not that problematic to deal with. So if this were a 3/7, sure, this minion's maybe crazy. If Ashes of Alar has like 5 health, I think it's much scarier. As it stands, these breakpoints, these numbers just don't make sense for me. I think Alar actually looks rather weak. Next up here, we got Imprisoned Scrap Imp, another one of our Imprisoned Dormant Demons. 2 mana, 3/3 demon. Dormant for 2 turns. When this awakens, give all minions in your hand +2/+2. So a delayed hand buff effect here for Imprisoned Scrap Imp, and that really sums up my issues with this card. First off, hand buff is a mechanic that is so rarely worked well in Hearthstone. We've seen like some Mech Paladin hand buff stuff was kind of okay for a little while there with Glowstone Technician, but Magnetic really helped putting those stats into play faster. Most decks and archetypes would really struggle to do that well. And not only that, Imprisoned Scrap Imp adds a 2-turn delay to your hand buff as well. So you don't really know what you're going to hit and what's going to be left in your hand by the time this goes off. You can try to control for it, right? Like, oh, I really need to hold this big taunt minion in my hand to make this good, or hold this rush minion to make the Imprisoned Scrap Imp good. But then you're creating problems for yourself. It's like, oh, I got to play this. Like, oh, what do I do? What do I do? Plus, you don't know what you're going to draw in the meantime, particularly for Warlock if you're drawing additional cards. Like, am I going to draw 2 spells or 2 minions? Making this really hard to figure out when to play. Plus, if you want to naturally play this like on turn 2 on curve to get the stats as soon as possible coming down in the mid game, you're giving up a pretty operative turn to either hit that life tap button in a slower deck or play some stats out in a faster, stat-based deck, which is probably going to be the kind of thing that loves Imprisoned Scrap Imp. So basically, delaying stats, delaying tempo, and delaying initiative are all recipes for disaster in Hearthstone historically. And I don't think this hand buff is big enough or significant enough to make up the difference. Maybe you could combine this with some Shadow Council stuff and like just try to set up this enormously overbuffed hand to swing the game in the mid game, but then you've got inconsistent minion choices. So all in all, I don't know if Imprisoned Scrap Imp can really ever get there. Maybe with Rush, maybe with Lifesteal, maybe with Taunt to give the stats faster operational effectiveness, but most of the time I think this is just too slow and too awkward If you bumped it up to like +4/+4, made the stat line on this guy crazy, gave it taunt, handful of things could help shift this in a better direction. But as it stands right now, I just don't think the numbers get big enough to make up for the lack in speed. Next up here, we have the Marsh Hydra, a 7-mana 7/7 beast for Druid with Rush meta. And it reads, after this attacks, add a random 8-cost minion to your hand. So right off the bat, you get a nice on-curve play, potentially, from your Marsh Hydra. You got that clean 7 into 8. If it survives, you can maybe generate quite a bit of value with multiple 8-drops. If you look at the 8-drop pool as we know it right now in Hearthstone, I'd say it's pretty solid. Things like Hyreek rotating out, which Hyreek's not even that bad necessarily to get off something like this because it's not being summoned, it's played from hand. But nonetheless, still pretty good options to get those Tyrion-style minions, Alakirs, etc. Always going to be around for a card like this one. So is that worth it, right? What deck's going to run this? Possibly an Embiggen Druid could use this. I actually think Embiggen Druid cares too much about can't be targeted and cares too much about taunt for a card like Marsh Hydra to make the cut. That said, I don't play a lot of Embiggen Druid. I play like 0 Embiggen Druid. So I'm not maybe the best person to tell you whether this fits into Embiggen Druid or not. I think it's kind of an iffy fit at best. And if it doesn't fit into Embiggen Druid, I really worry where the context for this card lies because I don't know who else is going to run this. Like, yes, Rush gives it some interactivity on board, which is nice, but it's still a really big mana commitment. And the way we see Druid being played outside of exactly Embiggen right now, they're not usually willing to commit that much mana into a singular unit like this. So basically, given how bad I think this minion's going to be against like wider boards or even kind of medium-sized boards of like 2 or 3 5/5s, this just doesn't interact all that efficiently, right? And beyond that, 8 drops, like, while they're not a bad pool, the pool has some good minions, they're just often not synergistic with your deck. They're not playing towards some specific game plan. So it would be an okay minion, but not one that necessarily forwards your game plan or anything. It's just kind of a random resource that might be hard to commit 8 mana to. I think randomly generated resources are often better when they're cheaper because you can kind of flex them in and you're not committing too much. This one makes you commit quite a bit. So I don't think the scalability of like multiple 8-drops is worth much. I think the body here is certainly okay and the rush aspect's fine, but context is challenged. All of that means Marsh Hydra to me, like, although an amazing arena card, no question this will be insane in arena, I just don't see a place for it in Constructed. Next up here is the Underlight Angling Rod. It's a 3-mana 3/2 weapon for Paladin, and it reads, after your hero attacks, add a random Murloc to your hand. So we have ourselves here another little resource generator, and it's attached to a fine weapon, that new Fiery War Axe stat line. We've seen Paladin run some 3-mana 3/2 weapons in the past to success, so that looks okay at a base level. I think probably True Silver Champion becomes a more relevant weapon option for a vast majority of decks, though. So I think the Murloc aspect has to be important here. So on that note, is the Murloc option actually any good? Well, I worry a random Murloc isn't very good. Even if you're playing a Murloc deck, there are so many low rolls in the Murloc pool, or cards that just, demand a certain amount of timing to be good. Like, even if you get a Grimscale Oracle, you have to have other Murlocs on board ready to attack to make that guy relevant. Even Murloc War Leaders are sometimes just 3/3s if there isn't the support and you have the initiative to attack right now. So beyond that, the challenge I think is Murloc decks often want to play Murlocs on turn 3. Like, they have some really big follow-up Murlocs on 3, which pushes this into more awkward mana turns later in the game, perhaps, where the 3 attack is not as relevant. So I do think this card has some challenges to overcome, plus it's just so narrowly defined in my mind. I can't envision a control deck ever like tossing in an Underlight Angling Rod to make some random Murlocs, because they definitely won't care about random Murlocs. It's just kind of garbage trash being added to your hand. All of that means is this is a fine looking card across a number of standpoints. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with upside. That's cool. But nonetheless, what environment does this work in? That's a struggle for me. So next up here, we have the Dragonmaw Overseer, a 3-mana 2/2 that reads, at the end of your turn, give another friendly minion +2/+2. So we saw a card like this long ago, the Shadow Ascendant for Priest. It was basically just take all these numbers and kind of subtract 1, I guess. It had the same stat line, but smaller buff and smaller mana cost. That card was like not very good. People tried to make it work in some tempo Priest stuff, but it never quite made it to real meta relevance. Like, it was playable, but you never got like a tier 1, tier 2, or even probably a tier 3 deck out of it. And Dragonmaw Overseer, though, is coming into a new Priest world where we have a redefined Priest classic set that I think does have more early tempo-based minions. There are things that are more focused on playing out faster cost minions and buffing health on board. So you might have a stickier early game presence in Priest than you used to have. Nonetheless, I see some fundamental problems with Dragonmaw Overseer. First off, it's very dependent on having something on board. You can't just really play this down on turn 3 and be happy unless you've managed to keep a minion alive. So that's challenge number 1, is like if you do lose the early board, this card dies in your hand, which I think is problematic for decks that rely on early consistent minion pressure. Having a card that fails at early consistent minion pressure is a problem. Beyond that, this buff happens at the end of turn, so even if you do follow up, like you manage to stick a 1-drop or a 2-drop, you play this down afterwards, these stats don't really get to interact right away, so you can't like use them to take a favorable trade, for instance. You can't value trade over something that your opponent played. You're stuck with that base level of stats you had before. So yes, it's kind of investing in a future turn, but if this was just, you know, a 3-4, it would also invest in a future turn because it would add some additional survivability. So for instance, when I compare this to a card like maybe Cabal Talon Priest, another old classic early minion focused Priest minion, that one gave you the stats immediately to help you trade. It was a bigger body itself, so it kind of invested in itself a little bit more and invested in immediacy a little bit more, whereas this is more about this passive long-term scaling upside that I think is unlikely to realize, because this is never going to live for very long at 2 health. It's just 1 backstab, some cheap rush minions away, Desert Spear trade away. It's just not going to live often. So I don't think the scaling that gives it its value is really ever going to persist and get there. What that means is awkward the turn you play it sometimes, limited long-term upside. Dragonmaw Overseer feels kind of weak to me. I know some people really like this card. We talked about it on stream a bunch, but I'm just not seeing this one line up. And all of that is conditional on the fact that Priest has to have an early game tempo deck. If they don't have the early game tempo deck, totally forget about it, right? So it's got a lot of different contexts and even kind of power level problems to overcome. So next up here, we have Bogspine Knuckles, one of my card reveal cards. 5 mana 4/2, after your hero attacks, transform your minions into random ones that cost 1 more. So a lot of very favorable reactions to this card, and I too think it's pretty good, but I perhaps want to pull back on expectations a little bit that I've seen in the community so far. So 4/2 is a great stat line for weapons. We know that. That's been used very successfully. We know evolve effects have been great in Shaman historically, even pretty recently in the Doom in the Tomb event where wild cards came back to standard format for a while. Evolve was really, really dominant and oppressive. But I think there's a really important distinction here with Bogspine Knuckles we need to consider at least a little. I think evolve effects are best when they're very cheap and efficient to play so that you can play out minions in the same turn that you evolve. It's great to follow up a board that already existed with evolve effects, but most of the really powerful evolve turns, you're playing stuff simultaneously. And I think that's a little bit harder to do on the first turn of Bogspine Knuckles, because you're committing to 5 mana. So I would say like half of this card's effect is pretty tough to realize, because you have to be ahead on board when you do that. Now, of course, this is a weapon, so you can load it up for the future and have that second swing, presumably, where you can play stuff at the same time. And then it's a free evolve, which that feels really, really good to me. It's just that you're kind of backloading it and delaying it by a turn, which concerns me. Not only is things like weapon removal a possibility in the meantime, but your opponent kind of knows what's coming and can perhaps set up for it a little better. So that's a bit of a concern. That's a worry. That said, I still think the like output of this card is going to be high enough that it overcomes that. Just because first off, it's a pretty solid weapon. If this was like a 2/2 or a 3/2, I'd be more worried. But as a 4/2, I think you're going to be happy to just get the turn with the attack in a lot of cases. And maybe just evolving 1 or 2 random things, even a totem that has lingered behind, is going to feel like the upside because you need to play the weapon. And then you go nuts the turn after. But I'm not sure you can build like a really evolve-centered deck around this with things like Desert Hares. It might be tough. Like even though this happens on 5, you could like double Desert Hare on turn 6. I don't think that feels like a great play because you got so much stuff sitting in hand. It's a bad minion otherwise. There are some consistency issues to overcome there. So I don't know if this is actually the return of Evolve Shaman as I teased in my card reveal. Like maybe. I feel like more of this is just sort of a utility card that has some occasional upside when you're running things like Battlecry minions where you realize the value of the Battlecry and you try to turn a weak body into something a little bit more significant. So more of a utility card and less of a build-around card, but nonetheless a card that still has quite a bit of power level bundled into it. So next up here, let's talk about Bogstraw Clacker, the other half of my card reveal. It's a 3 mana 3/3 Battlecry, transform adjacent minions into random ones that cost one more. Now, Boxrock is a little bit cheaper than our previous card, which is nice. Like I said, you sometimes need that mana flexibility to play stuff on the same turn. I think that's going to be more possible with Boxrock. Plus, this is probably a fine like tempo follow-up play in the early game. If you play a couple lackeys early, a totem on turn 2, you hit 1 or 2 minions with this, and you feel like you've made a pretty substantial stat play for 3 mana. Plus, of course, this has Battlecry synergies in Shaman, which can be pretty easy to explore with things like the quest, and maybe double this up in the late game to really help scale that evolved nature. Now, this is limited to 2 minions. There could occasionally be some positional disadvantages here where you kind of need specific things to be evolved and you've got them all out of whack and in the wrong place, but that's fine. I think that can all be overcome and played around pretty carefully. So I think Boxrock Clacker actually kind of a lot of the same things as our previous card. It's got some good base level stats. You know, it's a fine 3 mana 3/3. So even if it whiffs on the evolve, you haven't felt like you've wasted your entire turn, much like the weapon. You still get that weapon activation, so you're pretty happy to just get the attack through. And what that means is we've got, I think, a solid evolve card here that perhaps doesn't build into an evolve deck, but is complementary to certain other shaman decks. And it's just one of those cards that feels good to play, if not absolutely fantastic. And then finally here, one card I missed. I didn't see this one previously, but it popped up on my radar, and I was like, oh, hey, we got a basic set Demon Hunter card here, Chaos Strike, a 2-mana spell that gives your hero +2 attack this turn and draws you a card. And this is a pretty basic, boring card in a lot of ways. It's some card draw bundled with a little bit of an attack buff. I think it's totally fine. It's not really got me excited. I don't think it's scaling like crazy. 2 attack on turn 2 might help you clear a minion, move through your deck. That's certainly a fine play. It's got some synergies, certainly with Demon Hunter, where they can use this attack value to do other things. So it's a solid card. It looks like it does good things. It's not crazy high powered, but feels good and could certainly be played. That may have been the most phoned in card review I've ever done. Obviously, not too much to talk about here with Chaos Strike. Astromancer Solarian is a 5-star card. Shadowjeweler Hanar is a 4-star card. Alar is a 2-star card. Imprisoned Scrap Imp is a 2-star card. Marsh Hydra, 2 stars, 12 in Arena maybe? Underlight Angling Rod is a 3-star card. Dragonmaw Overseer is a 2-star card. Bogspine Knuckles is a 4-star card. Boxrock Clacker is a 4-star card. Chaos Strike is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Some pretty exciting, crazy stuff coming in Ashes of Outland very soon. Share your thoughts on these cards in the comments below. Stay tuned for more reviews. But until then, thanks much for watching. And until next time, game on.